Hello, my friends. Jeremy Siskind here, the author of the Jazz Piano Fundamentals book series. There's 3 volumes. Today, we're going to be working with Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2, the purple book, a little bit. I also wrote Playing Solo Jazz Piano. And if you're looking for some great arrangements of jazz standards to play, you could check out Solo Standards for Piano. What are the tunes? Embraceable You, Mac the Knife, If I Had You, I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Softly's in the Morning Sunrise, Lover Come Back to Me, Love Me or Leave Me, and Sweet Lorraine. Hits, all of them hits. All right, we are continuing on in this voicing series, and this is actually a transition point where we're moving from modal voicings into what I might call thickened line voicings. And thickened line voicings are voicings that take a melody as the kind of given part and then harmonize it. And the 2 main thickened line voicings that we're going to work with are closed position voicings, also known as shearing voicings, and drop 2 voicings. And today's going to focus more on closed position voicings. Now, I love teaching closed position voicings. I think they have this kind of cool, old-fashioned sound, and I think they're very useful for improvisation because it forces your right hand in particular to find all of these hand positions that define the chord really well. It also forces you to really understand what's a chord tone and what's a non-chord tone. So I try to teach it to just about all of my students, even if, closed position voicings have an old-fashioned kind of a sound. So even if you don't want to play with these voicings, I think you're going to learn a lot of useful things from studying them. So open up your hymnals, by which I mean Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. Again, that's this purple book, which is for intermediate students. I'm on page 153. And actually, before I say anything, before we go over the material in the book, let's take a moment and just listen to and experience some closed position voicings, and then we'll talk about what the underlying principles are. And in fact, let's do this view so you can see what I'm playing if you want to. So there's a little bit of Don't Get Around Much Anymore, a standard tune using closed position voicings. And if you listen closely, I think I quoted Pure Imagination in there, which is kind of fun. So what are the basics of closed position voicing? So closed position voicings, aka shearing voices, named after the blind British pianist George Shearing. These are voicings that span an octave between the top and the bottom note. Okay, so from C to C, from A to A, from F sharp to F sharp, we're always going to have an octave. And that outside note is going to be the melody note, right? Remember, I said that these types of voicings are designed to harmonize a melody. So here I wrote some of the defining characteristics of closed position voicings. We're gonna have 5 notes total between the left hand and right hand. The second one is really important. 4 notes in the right hand, 1 in the left. Now, like any rule, there are some exceptions, but I would encourage you, if you're newer to this, to really hold to 4 notes in the right hand, 1 in the left as you practice. The top and bottom notes are the melody note, and there's an octave between the top and bottom notes, meaning that they're the same pitch. Now, before we go on to this next section of the book, I want to talk about how we actually use closed position voicings. Okay, so because I think I think students don't really quite understand. So the number one thing is to harmonize a melody, right? Like I did for Don't Get Around Much Anymore. Right? right, I took this melody of the tune and I thought it's almost like a saxophone section is playing the melody, right? Okay, so I take the given melody, I harmonize it. That's number one. Number two, the most important and I think most misunderstood thing here is to comp. How do we do that? There's no melody when we comp. Well, the answer is that we invent the melody and then we harmonize that as we go with the closed position voicings. And when I say melody, I don't mean that we have to have something incredibly beautiful, singable, operatic. Just we need a top note. So if I'm comping for Don't Get Around Much Anymore, maybe I'll come up with, it's like a background in a big band. Do, 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 do. Ba, do, do. All right, and then I'll harmonize. I'm gonna keep going. Right, so I'm inventing the melody, keeping it nice and simple, and then I'm harmonizing that melody so we have, again, what sounds like a background in a big band chart behind the soloist. And then the third way is to actually improvise a solo. And so again, when we're doing that, just like the comping, we're improvising a melody and harmonizing it at the same time. Is this difficult? Yes, it is difficult. Is it possible? Absolutely, it's possible. I could demonstrate. Now, when we do this, we're probably inventing a more complex melody than when we're comping because we're the featured soloist. So if I'm improvising a closed position solo on Don't Get Around Much Anymore, I'm coming up with more complex melodies, harmonizing these with closed position voicings. Okay, now, I feel like if you have been studying jazz a while, so many people, the only thing that they really understand is this Barry Harris bebop scale. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't. I have a really simple, quote unquote, the details are always complicated, but the system itself at least is simple for figuring out how to use these closed position voicings over an actual tune, not just harmonizing this bebop scale, which is mostly useless other than as an exercise. Like, I don't know where you can really use it in a tune that much. All right, so here's the three-part system. One is you've got to classify melody notes as either chord tones or non-chord tones. We'll talk about that briefly, but this is so key because then we're going to do different things with the notes, whether they're chord tones or non-chord tones. So if they're chord tones, we're going to harmonize that note with other notes from the chord. And if they're non-chord tones, I give three options. There's certainly more things that we could do than this, but these are three really solid options. We're going to harmonize the non-chord tones with diminished seventh chords, side steps, or tonicizations. Okay. Now, I'm not trying to get too deep into this. Step one is to separate the melody into chord tones and non-chord tones. And I'll link a video in which I talk more at length about chord tones and non-chord tones. But in short, non-chord tones could be any note that resolved by step to a chord tone. So often you get the question, well, is the ninth a chord tone? Is the seventh a chord tone? Is the 11th a chord tone? And the answer is it depends on the function. So example A is my favorite way to get people to understand this. Here's two different measures of improvisation or melody on a D minor set, right? And if we were analyzing the chord tone numbers, we'd say, okay, it's the ninth and the third. And this one's seventh, ninth, seventh, fifth, third. Okay, so they both have the ninth here. But in this instance, the ninth, the E, is resolving by half step to the third, right? If we're looking at its function, we'd probably say it's a chromatic neighbor leading to the third. Whereas here, that ninth, that E, is part of an arpeggio. We're leaping into it, leaping away from it. It's not a passing tone. It's not a neighbor tone. It's not part of a double neighbor or anything like that. So here it would be a chord tone. I'm calling it CT for chord tone. Whereas here it would be a non-chord tone. Same pitch against the same chord, but different functions, just depending on what's actually happening in the music. So here, this is a neighbor tone. There's not really that many types of non-chord tones in jazz. There's basically neighbor tones, passing tones, double neighbors. That's essentially it from my perspective. You can get into more complicated stuff, and in the book we get into slightly more complicated stuff. All right. Once you figure that out, you're going to harmonize chord tones with other notes from the chord. And I have a little diagram here in the book. You're welcome to take a screenshot or write it down. Or hey, you could buy the book at jeremysiskind.com. You know, why settle for second best? And basically we have 4 categories, right? Remember, there's 5 notes, but 2 of them, the top and bottom, are the same. So in general, we're going to want to include either a root or a ninth, a third, a fifth or 13th, and a 7th or 6th. All right. So when we have these chord tones, we're going to harmonize them using notes from each of those 4 categories. Why don't I just give you a voicing type? Well, remember, sometimes we're going to have the third in the melody. Sometimes we're going to have the fifth. Sometimes we're going to have the ninth. So we're going to have to come up with different inversions for these chords depending on what note is in the melody, what chord tone is in the melody. Okay. We're moving fast here because this isn't an intensive class. This is just a quick hit. And then step 3 for non-chord tones, whatever you've analyzed as a non-chord tone, we're going to harmonize them as diminished 7th chords, side steps, meaning a half step lead in, or tonicizations, meaning a 5 chord leading to treating whatever chord it is as the 1. Diminished 7th chords and tonicizations are often very similar, but with tonicizations, you're going to be able to add more alterations, whereas diminished chords are just set as the kind of notes they are. So let's take that example from the text of E as a non-chord tone to F as a chord tone. So this F, I'm just going to harmonize with some of the basic notes of D minor 7. I've got 3rd, 5th, 7th, root. The E, first option, harmonize it with a diminished 7th chord. You don't have to think about which diminished 7th chord to use because each pitch only has one diminished 7th chord associated. Or I could use a side step. So if I'm doing a side step, I'm going to take this target chord and I'm going to move everything by a half step. So this is like a D flat minor 7. Slightly different sound. Notice here's the diminished chord. Here's the side step. And then the dominant 7th, again, so I'm thinking if I'm doing a tonicization, I'm going to be targeting D minor. So I'm using an A7. And so this would become the 5th. I need the 7th and the 3rd. And so if I use the flat 9th, I end up with exactly the same as the diminished 7th chord. So let's, just for the sake of doing something different, I'm going to use the natural 9th. Okay. Now, I don't think that sounds as good as using the flat 9th, but just for the demonstration. Where this really gets interesting is if it wasn't the 5th in the melody, we could add a flat 13 or a sharp 11th. But in this case, since the 5th is in the melody, those notes are going to conflict. Okay. I'm looking at how much time I've spent, how much I've had left. So let's do just a few measures as though we're harmonizing the melody of what a difference a day makes, like I've done in for everything in this series. And let's see, do I have a version with the melody? I do. Look at me, I came prepared. Aren't you proud of me? So I want to just do the first 4 measures, and we'll see if we even get that far, because this is kind of labor intensive. And it's also so hard to read these. I'll do my best to write really clearly, but there's just a lot of notes coming at you. You know, there's going to be 5 notes all within an octave, so it's very dense to read. Okay. So let's start from the beginning. And let's see. I'd probably consider this like an E flat 6. And the easiest thing to do here is to harmonize all of these notes with an inversion of the E flat 6 chord. So just literally using 1, 3, 5, 6 of E flat. Okay. So here I'm using the 1, 3, 5, 6, and I'll be playing these in the right hand, but I'd be using a ton of ledger lines if I wrote them all in the right hand. If I wrote all these notes in the right hand, so I'm writing them in the left. And let's pause for a second for something really important that I've skipped over. That's in the next chapter of this book, which is that the biggest reason that we're putting just one note in the left is that one note in the left hand is going to, or that the left hand is going to A, be primarily in charge of the articulation, including the legato, and then B, be in charge of the ornamentation. So the left hand, you need to play really intentionally and add some grace notes, some turns, some ghost notes as we're going here, because that's part of the fun and joy of this style. And the right hand can't do it. It has 4 notes that it's grabbing at once. So this is why it's so important to keep just one note in the left, mostly, and 4 in the right. All right, we only have 2 Fs, so far we have all chord tones here. So I'm just gonna add the missing notes of an F minor 7, the 3rd, 5th, and 7th. We don't have a lot of options here. Okay, so now we're in a really interesting place. Oh, I didn't mean for it to get this interesting. Why do I say this is really interesting? Because it's a B flat 7 chord, but look at what note falls on the strong beat. The only strong beat we have in this measure is the 11th, which is never really a chord tone. So I think in order to make this work, we're gonna have to call it a B flat sus. And so I'm going to use the 4th instead of the 3rd. And then I've got the 7th and the 5th, right? This isn't really rocket science so far. I'm adding the most basic chord tones. And I'm going to change to a flat 9th here, a C flat, to give it a little bit more tension, more color. Then I've only got 1 note per chord, so they kind of have to be chord tones. I guess I should keep going in black with the lowest note. So I'm going to add root 3rd, 5th, super basic. And then I'm going to add, let's see, I'll add the 5th, 7th, and the 9th. Okay, so this is an interesting moment here where the melody ties over, but the chord is changing. What we generally do there is we hold the melody and then softly, subtly change the chord in the middle. So I'm going to grab the 3rd and the 7th and the 5th of the G minor 7 so we can hear that chord. So you don't really want anybody to notice. Okay, I think we could finally use a non-chord tone. There haven't really been a lot of opportunities for non-chord tones here. But I think the C might be a good opportunity to use a non-chord tone. So first let's harmonize the D again with our basic notes. I use the 3rd and 7th in the root. I could imagine using the 3rd, 7th, and 9th if I felt like it. But let's harmonize this C as a non-chord tone. It's stepping into a chord tone. And let's harmonize it as a diminished 7th. So since it's a C, I'm going to use a C diminished 7th. And I think if I wanted, I could also harmonize that D as a non-chord tone, like 2 non-chord tones leading up to the E flat. There's definitely flexibility here. It's an art rather than a science. So let's go ahead and do that. I think that's going to sound a little bit nicer. So a C diminished followed by a D diminished. Okay, so then we're skipping around. So we need, what should I say here? We need to harmonize everything as a chord tone. The melody is the sharp ninth. It's E flat, and so I need the natural third in there right next to it, and I'm going to add the flat 13th as well. It's a little confusing to read. I tell you, it's a disaster to read. It might be easier to see here. And I'll just keep that same exact shape for those 3 melody notes, which is kind of nice. The middle part is just doing that 3 times. Okay. So, man, I didn't anticipate it, but we really mostly have chord tones here. Not a lot of non-chord tones to play with. If you did it slightly differently, it definitely doesn't mean that you're wrong. Might be clearer to read from here. So do, do, do. All right, guys, so that was a little crash course in how to actually use closed position voicings on a tune. I'm going to come back next video, and we're going to do the same thing with comping on What a Difference a Day Makes. I'm going to show you how I'll form melodies to comp, how I'm going to harmonize them. If you want to get deeper into this, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2 has 2 really good chapters that show a lot of examples on closed position voicings. So you might want to check that out. And let's see, since this was a crash course, if you've watched this far, why don't you comment something regarding a crash? Hopefully no crashes have happened to you. Thanks, everybody.